Big Brother, mainstream media, government cover-ups. You want answers? Well, so does he. He's Alex Jones on the GCN Radio Network. And now, live from Austin, Texas, Alex Jones.
It's Paul Joseph Watson with the Alex Jones Show on this Thursday, October 2nd, filling in for Alex. Hopefully we will have Alex calling in from the road a little later on in the show. We've also got Lionel from Lionel Media popping in the third hour to discuss media narratives, the latest Ebola news, and a whole gamut of different subjects. But we're focusing on Ebola in the first hour. David Knight will be in the second hour also. So the latest news, of course, is that we've now got potentially up to 100 patients, alleged supposed victims exposed to the Ebola virus as a result of this individual who arrived in Dallas last week from Liberia. We also have another case in Hawaii, which they're investigating at the moment. Not confirmed that it's Ebola, but they're saying that it's very possible that that could be the case. Now it's up to 100. Texas checks 100 for Ebola exposure. So yesterday it went from 12 to 18, 80 this morning. Now they're saying 100. We're also following another case in a different state where there is another potential Ebola victim. That's not being confirmed, but there is a medical worker there in that state saying that it is about to be confirmed within the next few hours. So we'll continue to keep track of that. Big headlines coming up today on the Alex Jones Show. Biggest, as far as I'm concerned, is on the top left of drudgereport.com, which is red-linked, and it's UN Ebola chief raises nightmare prospect that virus could mutate and become airborne if it is not quickly brought under control. Obviously, this is an issue that we've been discussing for weeks and months, the potential that Ebola has, at least to a limited extent, gone airborne. Now we have one of the UN's top Ebola professionals in charge of the situation saying the same thing. The longer the Ebola epidemic continues infecting people unabated, the higher the chances it will mutate and become airborne, the UN's Ebola response chief has warned. And this is Anthony Banbury, the Secretary General's special representative, who said that there's a nightmare prospect. And this is not Alex Jones saying this. This is the head of the UN Ebola response team. A nightmare prospect that the deadly disease will become airborne if it continues infecting new hosts. His comments come as organisations battling the crisis in West Africa warn that the international community has just 4 weeks to stop it before it spirals completely out of control. There you see the article out of the Daily Mail, which of course ties into this separate article which we've got up on Infowars.com, which we're going to cover in more detail, out of shtfplan.com. Max Slavo, who we're trying to get on the show today, if not today, maybe tomorrow, report disaster teams were notified months ago they would be activated in October. And this was DART teams, disaster assistance response teams. No word yet on exactly where in the country, but they were told to prepare to be activated in the month of October. And that's according to a public tweet from a large government supplier of emergency response products specializing in high-risk events. So they basically put out a tweet, and you can see it in this article there, said that we are now hearing this is the tip of the iceberg as we enter October. And in a subsequent tweet, they said DART teams were notified months ago they would be activated in October. Timing seems weird. And they cite the source as a current DART member, and that's Golden State Fire EMS, a company that specializes in high-risk events. They haven't retracted that on Twitter. It's still out there, so we're trying to pin down more details on that. Of course, in regard to the airborne transmission of Ebola, which the UN is now warning about, we had this story up on Infowars.com yesterday. Canadian Health Agency deletes info on airborne spread of Ebola. And this is the Public Health Agency of Canada. This is their official health agency. Around about the end of August here, you can see that they had an advisory on their website saying that airborne spread among humans is strongly suspected. They later deleted that. We're going to get into that and more Ebola info. We're going to get into the Hong Kong protests and a lot more besides that. Lionel coming up, Alex Jones popping in. This is the Alex Jones Show live, Thursday, October 2nd edition. I'm Paul Joseph Watson, filling in for Alex. We'll be right back with all the breaking Ebola news. Stay right there. Paul Joseph Watson, your host, filling in for Alex Jones. We expect Alex to be popping in at some point during the broadcast with breaking Ebola news. We're going to go to a clip in a minute out of local Hawaii news about a potential new Ebola case there. But as I was mentioning before the break, we had this story up on Infowars.com yesterday. Canadian Health Agency deletes info on airborne spread of Ebola. And this was one of the main sources that I cited, of course, in the aftermath of the 2012 Canadian study where they proved that Ebola could be spread via the respiratory tract between pigs infected with Ebola and monkeys who were kept in the same pen but separated by a wire fence. So there was no physical contact between them. Of course, we're being told over and over again that you can only catch Ebola by having physical contact, exchange of bodily fluids. But now top experts are questioning that, and as far back as the end of August, actually, the Canadian Public Health Agency, which is their official public health body, had on their official website this quote, which is the airborne spread among humans of Ebola is, quote, strongly suspected. Now, if you take a look at that now, it's changed. It says airborne transmission has not been demonstrated between non-human primates. So it's interesting that they rolled that back at the end of August, or just after the end of August, when all these questions were being asked about the airborne spread of Ebola. Of course, we had major doctors go public in the New York Times in the op-ed pages basically asking the same question. Has this mutated? Has it gone airborne, at least to some extent? Because we've had hundreds of health workers in Africa, including Western health workers, die after contracting Ebola. Of course, you would normally expect them to take the utmost precautions in avoiding bodily contact and avoiding swapping bodily fluids with Ebola victims, and yet hundreds have died, which of course leads to this top story, which is the UN's top Ebola chief raises nightmare prospect that virus could mutate and become airborne if it's not quickly brought under control. So basically, this top official, Anthony Banbury, is saying if we don't get a hold of this now, as it spreads, you know, in its natural state, which is not via airborne transmission, as far as we understand, if we don't clamp down on it now, then it could indeed go airborne. And of course, then that opens up a whole nightmare scenario. And again, major story up on Infowars.com today out of SHTF plan. Report disaster teams were notified months ago they would be activated in November. So this was disaster assistance response teams. According to a source within DOT, they were told last month, at least as long as a month ago, actually more than a month ago, that they would be notified or activated in October as a result of a major Ebola outbreak in the United States. You can see the tweets up there from Golden State Fire EMS, which is a company that sells health products and health services to government agencies in America, and they said that these DOT teams were notified months ago they would be activated in October. Timing seems weird, and people challenged them on that. They haven't retracted it, so we'll continue to dig into it. Another story which we're going to get into more detail about is this one. Commentary: health workers need optimal respiratory protection for Ebola. Now, this is fascinating because it's written by Dr. Brosso and Dr. Jones at the University of Illinois at Chicago, Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences. And basically, they asked the same question that this UN Ebola chief is asking. Do we truly understand the communicable nature of Ebola? They're talking about compelling the use of respiratory protection, not just face masks. So in this article, they get into the fact that Ebola has, quote, unclear modes of transmission. They talk about their belief that there's, quote, a scientific and epidemiological evidence that the Ebola virus has the potential to be transmitted via infectious aerosol particles both near and at a distance from infected patients, which means that healthcare workers should be wearing respirators, not face masks. So our current understanding is that this Ebola virus can be transmitted via droplets from coughing or sneezing, but that you have to be very near the victim, so within 3 feet. According to this study by these professors out of the University of Illinois in Chicago, that's not the case. They talk about the fact there's been a lot of online and published controversy about whether the Ebola virus can be transmitted via aerosols. Most scientific and medical personnel, along with public health organizations, have been unequivocal in their statements that Ebola can be transmitted only by direct contact with virus-laden fluids. And we've heard that over and over again. over the past couple of days, with this case arriving in America, of course, the CDC, other health authorities, trying to downplay the threat of Ebola after the fact that they botched it by allowing this Ebola victim to basically walk around Dallas for a period of 4 days, exposing at least 100 people to the Ebola virus. In the aftermath of that going public, they downplayed any potential that this could be airborne. But as we've seen both with the UN official, top German virologists, doctors that have written editorials in the New York Times, it's very much a concern, and it's a concern for these professors out of the University of Illinois. They talk about the fact that our current understanding that Ebola is not airborne transmissible, at least to a limited extent over 3 feet, reflects, quote, an incorrect and outmoded understanding of infectious aerosols, which has been institutionalized in politics, language, culture, and approaches to infection control. So they go through the fact that this could indeed be airborne to a greater extent than 3 feet, to a greater extent than somebody coughing and sneezing, which, of course, in terms of airline travel, is crucial. No flights have been cancelled so far, despite the fact that France, the United Arab Emirates, Britain, and other countries have cancelled flights as a result of this Ebola outbreak in Africa weeks and months ago. Now, flight attendants and border patrol agents in America are being told to watch for signs of Ebola, despite the fact that I saw a case on CNN the other day where the CNN reporters who had been in Liberia openly stated to border control, to the flight attendants, that they had been there, they need to be checked for potential exposure to the Ebola virus, potential symptoms. The Customs and Border Patrol agents, according to these CNN reporters, were not interested. So we've had the CDC saying for months that they had this under control, that it wasn't a threat. You know, Obama said it was very unlikely there would be an Ebola case in the United States. And it appears they've been caught with their pants down completely unprepared for this. They failed to deal with it when it sprung up in Dallas. Now we've got a new case in Hawaii, a potential new case, and we're going to go to a local news clip about that now.
Joe, health officials say they just found out about this possible case this morning, and they do not want the public to be concerned.
We are early in the investigation of a patient, very, very early, who we are investigating who might have Ebola.
State health officials confirm tests are being conducted on a patient who remains hospitalized. The Hawaii Nurses Association said the person is being treated at Queens.
It's very possible that they have Ebola, but I think it's also even more likely that they have another condition that presents with similar symptoms.
Dr. Melissa Veray said the patient could have a number of illnesses, including Ebola, flu, malaria, and typhoid. She wouldn't tell me any symptoms the person was having or if the person had recently traveled to West Africa. But she did say a big red flag of Ebola is a fever and recent travel to that area.
Why is this person being isolated?
So again, when we've asked the hospitals to tell us about, is anyone with a travel history and anyone with a fever, and when those two come together, we've asked them to be very careful and in an abundance of caution while you're working them up for whatever else might be going on. Also make sure you isolate against Ebola just in case that is the case.
That's
so it sounds like
out of Hawaii, a potential new case of Ebola. Not confirmed yet. As I said at the beginning of the show, we're also tracking a case in a different state where a health professional, a medical worker, claims that there is a case that they're about to announce in a completely different state. So if that's the case, it would bring us up to a potential of 3, but only 1 confirmed so far, of course, in Dallas. But he potentially exposed up to 100 people or more to the Ebola virus, mainly because he went into the hospital on September the 26th and was turned away, was given antibiotics, despite the fact that he told hospital workers that he had just flown in from Liberia and that he had the symptoms associated with the onset of Ebola. Here's an article out of The Guardian. US Ebola patient told staff of Liberia travel but was allowed to leave hospital. So our initial understanding of this was that he didn't tell the nurses, the hospital workers, where he had come from. They didn't ask. That was obviously the first faux pas, but now we know that he actually told them directly he had come from Liberia, yet they still asked no questions whatsoever, gave him some antibiotics, and sent him on his way for a further 2 days after he had already been in Dallas since September 20th. And again, no questions asked. We've also got this out of CNN Health. Hospital dropped the ball with Ebola patient's travel history, NH official says. The first person to be diagnosed with Ebola on American soil went to the emergency room last week but was released from the hospital even though he told staff he had travelled from Liberia. A travel history was taken, but it wasn't communicated to the people who were making the decision. It was a mistake. They dropped the ball. And that was very apparent in the press conference yesterday, where they deflected basically any questions about how this was allowed to occur, how this patient was allowed to wander around Dallas for a period of days. We're going to be back after the break with more Ebola news, also switching gears into other topics. Going to take your calls, 1-800-259-9231. David Knight coming up, second hour. Lionel, third hour. Alex Jones Show live, Infowars.com. We've got a big top story up on Infowars.com right now. Rand Paul, political correctness hindering scientific decisions on Ebola outbreak. And he says, quote, "My suspicion is that it's a lot more transmissible than we've been told." So this ties into the warning from the UN head that it could have gone airborne. Now we have Rand Paul complaining about political correctness and that hindering the CDC in being able to deal with this Ebola outbreak. Also saying that it's possibly a lot more transmissible than we've been told, which is developing into a common theme. We also have this article out of Reuters. Dallas Ebola patient vomited outside apartment on way to hospital. So we know that he was taken to the hospital inside this ambulance, which was then used for 2 days afterwards, potentially exposing other people, health workers, to the Ebola virus. Also, it came out yesterday, I believe, that this individual, Thomas Eric Duncan, first contracted the Ebola virus, having helped one of his family members back in Liberia into a taxi. I believe it was a pregnant woman that was stricken with Ebola. He helped her into a taxi back in Liberia. There's the article out of the New York Times. U.S. patient aided pregnant Liberian, then took ill. So, I mean, it almost certainly he knew that he would contract Ebola having done this. Then he flies to the United States almost immediately to get treatment. And I've seen questions being asked for the people who can afford it. Obviously, the hospitals in Africa are completely overwhelmed by this. People who turn up for treatment fearing they're an Ebola victim get turned away. We've seen videos where people are just hanging out the back of ambulances. They can't even make it into the hospital. No one's really helping them into the hospital because they don't have any beds available in those West African countries, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and others. So the question is being asked, you know, if this guy had the money, could he have traveled to the United States in the knowledge that he would get the best health care, having contracted Ebola and knowing that he had done so from this pregnant woman? Of course, they turned him away. He told them he had come from Liberia, gave him antibiotics and turned him away. Now we have the global situation, which is just getting increasingly drastic every day. BBC reports Ebola outbreak, 5 infected every hour in Sierra Leone. A leading charity has warned that a rate of 5 new Ebola cases an hour in Sierra Leone means healthcare demands are far outstripping supply. Save the Children said there were 765 new cases of Ebola reported in the West African state last week, while there were only 327 beds in the country. So again, they're completely overwhelmed. They can't take in the staggering number of patients that this is impacting. And here at the end of the article, we see the scale of the disease is also, quote, massively underreported, according to the charity, because, quote, untold numbers of children are dying anonymously at home or in the streets. So this figure of Ebola deaths so far, 3,338, of course, many more infected, recovered, could be many more, because a lot of them just aren't being recorded. A lot of people are just collapsing and dying in the streets. So if you think it's bad now, I mean, imagine living in those West African countries. We had top German virologists talking about 5 million dead in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, because the virus is just going to burn itself out, according to him. It's just going to infect everybody. That's the only point where it's going to actually stop. Daily Mail Online reports 4 weeks to stop Ebola. 34 global organizations will warn international conference we have 1 month to stop the epidemic spiraling completely out of control. The international community has just 4 weeks to stop the Ebola crisis spiraling completely out of control. Organizations working in West Africa have today warned. So again, that ties in with the UN head, the top UN Ebola head, who said that this could be transmissible and it needs to be stopped now, as long as it isn't transmissible, according to our understanding, before it potentially mutates, goes airborne, which of course is a nightmare scenario, in his words. UN Ebola chief, virus could mutate and become airborne if it is not controlled. We're going to get into that and more Ebola news. We're also going to cover some geopolitical stuff. We're going to go to your calls, 1-800-259-9231. This is the Alex Jones Show live, Infowars.com for all the breaking news. Stay tuned. Lionel coming up in the third hour. David Knight in studio. Don't go away. Just going to talk about oxy powder for a second, because of course every time I come to Austin, every time I talk to anyone from Austin, they're talking about their allergies, they're talking about their immune system being crippled. This product cleans you out while you sleep with gentle oxygen. It has none of the nasty side effects associated with harsh herbal colon cleansers. It's the only colon cleansing product with ingredients backed by real clinical studies on safety. And we've just got a new shipment in on oxy powder at InfoWarsStore.com. And again, we go back to the fact that health is one of the key areas where you can reclaim personal responsibility and freedom. You know, people are always asking us for solutions, and that is one area of your life which you can directly regain control over. And that's what it's all about. If you can regain control over these certain aspects of your life, you can empower yourself to make better decisions about your life. And obviously, in terms of health, this is going to help you all around the board. That's oxy powder. Also, DNA Force up on InfoWarsStore.com contains patented ingredients based on Nobel Prize science and backed again by real clinical research. And this DNA Force has more potent antioxidant activity than vitamin C. Help energize your cellular powerhouse, mitochondrial function, and sustain healthy cell cycles. InfoWars Life Formula line, again, another powerful product from there, DNA Force. I've been taking some of this stuff to help me get over the flu over the past week or so, and it's really helped. That's oxy powder and DNA Force at InfoWarsStore.com. Reclaim power over your health. Personal responsibility, again, is the key. And of course, it supports the broadcast and everything we do here at Infowars.com. So that's InfoWarsStore.com for the oxy powder, DNA Force, and all the other health products. Breaking news now out of NBCnews.com. Ebola patient Thomas Eric Duncan's nephew, I had to call CDC. The first person diagnosed with Ebola in the US wasn't appropriately treated for suspected infection until after a relative personally called the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, his nephew told NBC News on Wednesday night. Health officials have acknowledged that Thomas Eric Duncan, 42, was initially sent home from Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital in Dallas when he showed up on September 26, complaining of fever and abdominal pain. He had to return 2 days later in an ambulance. This is what the nephew says. That was the day, quote, I called CDC to get some actions taken because I was concerned for his life and he wasn't getting the appropriate care. Duncan's nephew, Josephus Weeks, told NBC News on Wednesday night. So again, we know before this guy, Thomas Eric Duncan, arrived in Dallas, he had helped an Ebola victim, a pregnant woman who subsequently died from the Ebola virus, into a taxi to get her to the hospital. He then contracted Ebola, flew to the United States via, I think it was Brussels and Washington Dulles, walks into a Dallas hospital, and again, they give him antibiotics, even though he tells them he just came in from Liberia. He has the early onset symptoms of Ebola. So now we're learning that his nephew had to directly call the CDC to warn that he was a potential Ebola victim until he could actually be isolated and get proper treatment. I mean, who knows? They gave him antibiotics the first time. Would they have sent him away again into the general population if this nephew hadn't have called the CDC? So, I mean, yesterday it was apparent that they completely dropped the ball. I mean, the screw-up gets even worse. Now we have the denials. NIH director on Ebola screw-up. I think we just need to put that behind us. He told MSNBC's Morning Joe earlier today. So again, move along, nothing to see here as potential new cases are being reported. Let's go to some of your calls on Ebola. Gabrielle in Michigan, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yeah, hey, Paul. Speaking of nothing to see here, I wanted to put up a statement that they're saying that you don't show symptoms until later, and they're screening people for fevers at the airport, and you're not going to have any symptoms if you have it, later come into the States, and then have a full-blown episode.
Well, precisely. I mean, there was an article out of Defense One yesterday which made the point that screening people at airports is completely useless because they cannot show these symptoms for days. We're told that Ebola can only be contracted when the symptoms start to be shown by the sufferer, but they can go days without showing any of these symptoms. There you see the article out of Defense One. There's really no way to screen for Ebola at airports, which is the only measure that they are now apparently putting in place. As of yesterday, Customs, Border Patrol and flight attendants are being told to watch for people with signs of fever, with signs of symptoms potentially linked with Ebola. Why that wasn't already in place, I don't know. But even now it is in place, it's really going to have little effect whatsoever. No flights have been cancelled as a result of this. It doesn't appear as if that's likely to be the case, even though several other major airlines across the world cancelled flights from Liberia weeks ago. Of course, that's more difficult to do in the case of the US because those flights aren't coming in directly from Liberia or from Sierra Leone. But there's been no indication whatsoever that the government, that the health authorities are planning to do that. So, again, this screening of temperature at airports is pretty much pointless because they could have Ebola and not show the symptoms for days. Thanks for your call. Martinez in Texas, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm kind of dovetailing this in Ebola with secession. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I was an advocate of secession, but it's always split in a political, fashion. Never have we had the chance and the view of our own federal government blatantly not caring for our safety and essentially sending us off in a war while there's an outbreak going on, telling us that we're okay, and of course it's not happening. It's time for really for us to start taking responsibility for our own states and our own homes and communities, because the federal government truly isn't going to be there. So really, my question is should we use this as our motive to really say this has nothing to do with politics? This has the pure, honest view of safety, and this is why we as states and we as Texas should break away, bring our own troops back, secure our own borders, protect ourselves, because the federal government isn't doing it.
Well, precisely. I mean, even in this one case alone, the CDC, after months of telling us they were prepared for a potential Ebola outbreak in the United States, they failed completely. More so the health authorities in Texas at the Presbyterian Hospital. But again, the CDC is now complaining that it's underfunded, that it doesn't have the capacity to deal with any of this. That's only come out now after Ebola has already arrived in the United States. That probably should have been a big issue 2 months ago, but it wasn't. So again, it's a good argument for secession in terms of localizing health authorities and dealing with this on a more decentralized basis, which would probably be more effective rather than this federal response, which again always seems to be botched, always seems to be in the pursuit of monetary or political power objectives in terms of this medical martial law infrastructure that the CDC has set up, particularly over the past 10 to 15 years. So that's a good argument for devolving power locally. Thanks for the call. We're going to go to Tion in Arizona. You're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to bring up the point. First of all, thanks for taking my call. But I wanted to bring up the point of the black coffins, Aaron Dyke's article in 2010 about the FEMA black coffins. I mean, I just wonder, you know, how soon are they going to be filling us Americans up in those coffins? And it just scares me.
As I said yesterday, I think the threat of the hysteria is going to be more visceral and potentially, you know, exploited by the feds as the threat of the virus itself, because it only takes, you know, perhaps a dozen cases across America in different states for this to really get hyped up. Of course, they've had 3,300 cases in West Africa. They're talking about 1.2 million by the end of January. Imagine if there were just a dozen or 24 cases in America in different states. I mean, this would engender some kind of panic, and I know the CDC is well aware of that. So, as I said, it's about managing the hysteria as much as it is about managing the actual virus. Obviously, if it goes airborne, which a lot of major health professionals, the UN head of the Ebola response team is now warning about, then that's another nightmare scenario, as he called it altogether. But we also had the article couple of days ago now, which was that the CDC advised funeral homes in the United States to prepare for an Ebola outbreak. They were telling funeral workers not to conduct autopsies or embalm corpses. They were giving them a list of recommendations. You see the article up on Infowars.com. So they're well aware that this could really escalate. That's obviously why they're talking to funeral homes. Hopefully it remains isolated. I think the good news is the fact that those ambulance workers that brought the Ebola victim into the hospital in Dallas were not infected with the virus, so that suggests that it's not airborne, at least in this case, and I hope that remains so. But thanks for the call. We're going to go to Tom in Idaho. Go ahead, Tom.
Hey, Paul. Good morning to you.
Morning.
Hey, have you guys heard of this fire chat yet going on in Hong Kong?
No, what's that? Go ahead and explain that to the listeners.
Man, they have got a free app that this guy has created that you don't need Wi-Fi or hotspot to communicate to your phone through texting. These protesters are using this app to communicate and organize their protests, and 100,000 apps in one day this creator got downloaded. It's spreading fast. Look into it. I've looked it up on the internet and gotten as much information as I can. It's hit a couple of mainstream news article feeds. Give it some credence and see where it goes. There you go, right there.
That's out of Forbes. FireChat prepares encryption feature as it drives Hong Kong protests. Yeah, I briefly saw this morning. I didn't get into the details. Twitter helped power the Arab Spring in 2012, which of course we also know was hijacked. Now the pro-democracy demonstrations setting Hong Kong in motion are being driven by a new kind of mobile technology, an underground messaging app called FireChat. So, yeah, as far as I understand it, this doesn't need Wi-Fi, that it says here, or a carrier connection to the chat to one another on the app. They only need another person with the same app within a 70-meter radius. That's useful in Hong Kong, where the influx of thousands of protesters have made cellular connections sluggish or non-existent. So the technology, I guess it's some kind of radio technology or some kind of extended Bluetooth. Within a 70-meter radius, they can communicate with each other without the need for Wi-Fi or cellular connections. That would be interesting to see where that originated from, because there are a lot of questions which we'll delve into later in the show about whether this Hong Kong uprising, given that it is from the outset looking in genuine. I mean, Beijing has openly announced they're going to hand select the Hong Kong politicians for the 2017 election, basically reimposing Chinese control over the area after Britain handed it back in 1997, but with those protections for political free speech and elections. So it seems to be a genuine uprising looking in from the outside, but then you get into the evidence now of who is funding it, which we're going to get into later, and it could indeed be a case of another colour revolution like we saw in Ukraine, that at least it was hijacked by these organisations such as the National Endowment for Democracy that we've seen before, subverting and infiltrating these mass protest movements, as we saw with the Arab Spring back 2-3 years ago. It could again be the case in Hong Kong. Not to say that those grievances aren't genuine, that the initial protest movement sprang up out of in that area, but it's something we're definitely going to dig into later in the show. Thanks for the call, though. We're going to go to Ben in Missouri. Go ahead, Ben.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for taking my call. I just wanted to say a couple things. First of all, my wife is a pediatric nurse, and she is going to forward me the email, but she's been briefed, and all of the employees have been briefed on Ebola. I know that that's not news or anything, but it's definitely, you know, it's true. It seems like it's coming. To me, the saddest part about this entire thing is I have this feeling that this is a drill. This is a live drill that's being run at the expense of the American people to see whether or not the government can contain a bioweapon. You know, the CDC, all the different government entities coming together to see if they can do it. And it's going to be done at the expense of the American people, just like everything else. It's crazy that I could even really think that that's happened, that could be the case, but you know, based on the criminals that run things in this country, it wouldn't shock me, it wouldn't surprise me, and I think that that might be the case.
That's the question that John Rappaport is asking in an article on prisonplanet.com today, tracking Ebola contacts, calling the surveillance state. He says, quote, "This is a perfect way for surveillance advocates to win love for their machine. We told you the NSA was absolutely necessary in order to protect the American people. Here's the proof. We can hunt and find carriers of the dreaded virus, and you and your children will be safe." So, as you mentioned, whether this turns out to be limited, which, you know, in all probability it will, hopefully it will, they could still hijack it to beef up this infrastructure of medical martial law that really came into the fore after 9/11, of course, with the anthrax attacks, which led directly back to Fort Detrick. They blamed a patsy. That all completely unraveled, but they used it again to beef up this medical martial law infrastructure. So, you know, the federal government tends to like to exploit these opportunities, never let a good crisis go to waste, in the words of Rahm Emanuel, to call forth the surveillance state, as John Rappaport says in his article, and that's precisely what we see unfolding. Thanks for the call. Jeff in Georgia, go ahead, you're on the air.
Oh, Paul, thanks for taking the call. Yeah, two things. Before we get started on the Ebola thing, I just wanted to remind, and because of you guys, Robert Tosh Plumley, his 11 questions. If you go back and look at those 11 questions, I think that you'll find that almost all of them have been answered by now just by the actions of the federal government. As far as the Ebola thing, you know, is this the October surprise? And, of course, one of the many that these guys are kind of springing us from all areas. Open borders, open airline flights from Africa into the United States, and Ebola breaks out. And can they get this thing cranked up enough to scare everybody away from the polls by November 5th? And if not this year, by 2016, would it mean that you would have to have your Ebola vaccination before you could vote because you're going to be in a public space?
It's an interesting point. We'll be back with more of your calls after the break. David Knight in studio coming up. Infowars.com. Stay right there. I'm Paul Joseph Watson, filling in for Alex Jones. He'll be calling in at some point, we hope, during the show. Coming up in the next hour, David Knight in studio, and Lionel of Lionel Media coming up in the third hour. He's always fun. We're going to discuss media narratives, Ebola, and a lot more. There's a doctor actually in Atlanta, we're going to get this clip maybe next segment, who's protesting against what he says are CDC lies with the Ebola situation. He actually dressed up in a hazmat suit, went to Atlanta International Airport and staged a one-man protest, a doctor, against the CDC for its handling of this Ebola incident in Dallas. So we're going to try and get that video for you soon. Up next on the line is Alan in Maryland. Go ahead, Alan. You're on the air.
Good afternoon there, Paul. That's some fine work you're doing over there at InfoWars. Now I'm going to make 3 points, and I'm going to make it very clear and make it quick. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are up to their necks in this stuff. They're trying to clear out Africa. We know that America is being dissolved in a vat of political acid. And China has been moving into Africa for years. So this is a way to get them, basically startled, stop their progress, etc. Bill Gates said the other night that this is not going to be the last epidemic. Bill Gates is up to his neck in this. We've been attacking vaccines now for, 5 years? Alex has been doing it for forever. And we know full well we put a huge dent in their money machine. I'll tell you something, folks. What we're looking at here is a false flag. The CDC lost smallpox, a truckload of smallpox, so they had to cover that up with Ebola. Now, Ebola is not going to affect us the way it does in Africa because we have fresh water, fresh food, vitamin C, vitamins, and especially we have Alex Jones and all his products and Dr. Group. But I want people to be on board here. The gentleman mentioned the October surprise. We've heard Robert Tosh Plumlee talk about false flags. You listen to these people speak. You look at their writings. Pay attention to silent weapons for quiet wars for silent weapons. When they tell you that superbugs are coming and they're here, you better believe they are not going to lose the money. Rockefeller, you've got Kissinger all over the place. You've got Brzezinski out there blabbing his mouth. Ladies and gentlemen, this is how they roll. And I tweeted, what bioweapon are they going to release on us next? 3 months ago. And within 30 days, we had Ebola. And there you have it.
Well, it's interesting because actually Louis Farrakhan, of all people, came out today and cited Dick Cheney's Rebuilding America's Defenses document, where he said that, germ warfare, biowarfare would improve to the point where it could target individual races. Obviously, I don't think that's the case with Ebola because we've had a lot of American health workers that have been infected with it that have come back, but definitely that's something that they had in the offing. In terms of Africa, as he said, China's got huge investment in that country. They're trying to absorb it into the BRICS financial structure that is destined to take on America. And that's the case. In Africa, there's a lot of rallying back between America and China. China has investments in Africa which dwarf those of America. We had these troops sent in by Obama recently to deal with the Ebola outbreak. A lot of questions being asked about what good troops would do in such a situation. And again, a lot of information should suggest that it could have been an undercover attempt to subvert, to infiltrate Africa in the guise of fighting Ebola, when in reality it was a geopolitical move against China. So we'll get into that and more after the break. David Knight's coming up in studio next. It's the Alex Jones Show Live. Stay tuned. We're back, second hour of the Alex Jones Show Live. I'm Paul Joseph Watson, filling in for Alex. I'm going to be joined by David Knight in a second. First, though, let's go to this clip out of Atlanta, which has been reported. Doctor dons Ebola protection suit to protest CDC. He's calling the CDC liars for their handling of this Ebola situation. Let's go to the clip.
My name is Dr. Gil Mobley. I'm an MD. I'm an emergency trauma physician and a microbiologist. I'm here this morning in the Atlanta airport to put out a public call for action. I believe the CDC is being dishonest with us about the propensity of importing Ebola cases to the United States. Once this disease consumes every third world country, as surely it will, because they lack the same basic infrastructure as Sierra Leone and Liberia, it will devour these countries. And at that point, we will be importing clusters of Ebola on a daily basis. That will overwhelm any advanced country's ability to contain the clusters of isolation and quarantine. That spells bad news. The CDC last week said the chance of importing Ebola was infinitesimal, and that was the same day the patient was misdiagnosed in Dallas. The CDC is derelict in their duty. Yesterday, I came through International Customs in the Atlanta airport. The only question they asked arriving passengers is if they had tobacco or alcohol. That is dereliction of duty. The CDC is asleep at the wheel.
Protesting against the CDC at Atlanta airport, as I mentioned earlier, a CNN news crew who came back from Liberia basically told the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol that they had been in Liberia in close quarters with people infected with Ebola. They were reporting on the situation. Basically, Border Patrol were not interested. They did nothing. They asked no questions. They took no tests. This was a couple of days before the outbreak. And as this doctor said, the CDC said it was an infinitesimal probability that the United States would see a case of this. Now it's arrived, so we've got anger protests against the CDC. David Knight joins us in studio for the latest on what the CDC is saying about the Ebola outbreak in Africa. David, what's the latest?
Well, now, Paul, they're saying that it's going to possibly reach anywhere from 500,000 to 1.5 million cases in West Africa by January. That's just 3-4 months away. That is a huge number if you look at the population, because that's just two countries where it's the worst right now, Sierra Leone and Liberia. Those two countries have a combined population of only about 10 million people. So you're looking at a very high percentage. You're looking at about 5% to 20% of the population the CDC is projecting is going to come down with Ebola by January in those West African countries. And so that really kind of puts all this that we've been hearing from Rick Perry and the CDC about how, don't worry, we have a wonderful medical infrastructure here compared to West Africa. Yes, we do. We also have a much larger population. We do not have infinite resources to handle anything. So what happens when you start to get a massive exponential increase in cases and you don't have the hospital staff, you don't have the capacity to deal with this? Because right now, it is still growing exponentially. We've got some other figures. We're going to break down those figures in detail coming from the CDC. We've also got some other information that I think people would like to know in some other areas. We've got Californians are now going to be able to get their relatives disarmed with a new law that's been passed in California. The U.S. government has relaxed the standards on killing civilians with drones in areas that are supposedly affected by ISIS. So we have some interest. And also there's another story out of Hong Kong, as that's building to a conflict. There's a story out of the Wall Street Journal talking about how there's a Christian subtext to this protest, besides the heavy-handedness of China saying that they're going to pick who the candidates are.
And we'll be back with that and more. We've also got Lionel from Lionel Media coming up in the third hour to discuss a host of subjects. More on Ebola coming up, more of your calls. David Knight in studio. This is the Alex Jones Show Live, Infowars.com. Keep it locked in. We're back on the Alex Jones Show Live, Thursday, October 2nd edition. Here's an article out of WorldNet Daily. We're going to talk about Obama, or President Ebola, as Michael Savage is calling him. Ebola has now entered the U.S. because of President Obama's open borders policy, charged talk radio host Michael Savage. Referring to the commander-in-chief as President Ebola, Savage said on his nationally syndicated show Wednesday, the quote, only solution is zero travel in and out of West Africa for any American. You let nobody in from a country where you have a raging epidemic, he said, emphasizing microbes do not discriminate. You isolate, you quarantine an entire nation if necessary. That's what Michael Savage is saying. We also
He's an epidemiologist, isn't he, Paul?
That's right, yeah. Yeah, that's right, doctorate in epidemiology. So that's what he's saying. Also, we had a strange story, which you mentioned, David, just during the break, which was this September 16th meeting that Obama had with the CDC and this incident which happened in the elevator. Explain that.
Yeah, I got a call from Richard Reeves here at InfoWars, and he noticed this connection, and he said everybody is talking about this being essentially the final straw for the director of the Secret Service when she got fired. He went to visit the CDC in Atlanta, and while he's on an elevator, there was a private security guard that they found had a gun that the Secret Service didn't know about. After they found out about it, it was a huge, obvious breach in protocol for them. But what nobody is talking about is the fact that Obama visited the CDC on September the 16th to talk about Ebola. At the same time, he's giving us assurances, don't worry, it's not going to come here. Okay, so that's an interesting data point, I think. Along with the other disinformation that we're hearing just yesterday, that Josh Earnest told the White House press secretary, told reporters that they have screening processes and procedures in place at our borders. They don't have that. Anybody that travels knows that they don't have it. And they had a doctor very, very angry about that who did a protest. Where was that? That was at the Atlanta airport where the CDC is. He donned a protective suit and wrote on the suit, CDC is lying. And we have a clip of that, too. We played that in just the last segment when we had the news. A lot of people don't get that. They get local news on that. Let's
go ahead and roll that clip again. the doctor process?
My name is Dr. Gil Mobley. I'm an MD. I'm an emergency trauma physician and a microbiologist. I'm here this morning in the Atlanta airport to put out a public call for action. I believe the CDC is being dishonest with us about the propensity of importing Ebola cases to the United States. Once this disease consumes every third world country, as surely it will, because they lack the same basic infrastructure as Sierra Leone and Liberia, it will devour these countries. And at that point, we will be importing clusters of Ebola on a daily basis. That will overwhelm any advanced country's ability to contain the clusters of isolation and quarantine. That spells bad news. The CDC last week said the chance of importing Ebola was infinitesimal, and that was the same day the patient was misdiagnosed in Dallas. The CDC is derelict in their duty. Yesterday, I came through international customs in the Atlanta airport. The only question they asked arriving passengers is if they had tobacco or alcohol. That is dereliction of duty. The CDC is asleep at the wheel.
Yeah.
And I mean, as I said earlier, these CNN reporters that had been to Liberia, they'd been in close quarters with these infected, exposed Ebola victims. They told the Customs and Border people directly, look, we've just been in Liberia. You need to do some tests on us just to make sure. And they ran no tests whatsoever. I mean, you know, I came in last week. They were certain to get my biometric fingerprints, but nobody who came through got tested for any kind of temperature, even though back in 2009 with the swine flu outbreak, literally when we landed in China, they boarded the plane in hazmat suits before you could get off the plane, scanned everybody's temperatures. So, I mean, David, do you agree that the CDC is basically asleep at the wheel, despite the fact they've been telling us for weeks that they were prepared for this?
Oh, absolutely. And when you look at the fact that Obama, in September 16th, long before we learned about this, even before the guy landed in the United States, they're saying that there's not any concern, but he's meeting with people at CDC. And then we have this article up on InfoWars today. Disaster teams were notified months ago that they would be activated in October. I find that interesting. Now, combine that with this report from the CDC that's estimating the future number of cases in the Ebola epidemic in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Now, what they are predicting is that those cases are going, if you look at this chart, if you're watching the broadcast, essentially you've got a hockey stick. Now, everybody has seen the hockey stick, the exponential growth graph, when Al Gore is trying to scare everybody about global warming. Here we have something that many people are being criticized, saying we're fear-mongering, we're creating hysteria, and yet part of the hysteria is being created because they're not being upfront with people. They're not advising people what the real risks and what they're seeing. They do the reports, but they're pretty much hidden. It's not being widely reported. This is a report that came out actually before they released the information about this individual. This is September the 26th. So this was something that had been in the works for a while. And they point out that within just 6 months, this was first identified in West Africa in Guinea on March 22nd of this year. So it's only been about 6 months. They say still the number of cases in Liberia are doubling every 15 to 20 days. That's one of the reasons why we're seeing survival rates of 50%. It's not that 50% of the people are getting better. It's just that the number of cases is expanding so rapidly that it makes it look like the number of people that are dying there is actually lower. The actual casualty figure and prognosis for people is about a 70% death rate. And Sierra Leone is not far behind. Now, to put this in perspective, Liberia only has a little over 4 million people. It's got a population about the size of North Carolina. Imagine if there were 3,000 cases of Ebola in North Carolina and you'd already had 2,000 deaths. That's what we're looking at. If you want to normalize that back to the United States, we're looking at a situation that went from just starting 6 months ago to a situation, if you normalize those numbers up to the population of the United States, about 300,000 people coming down with Ebola and about 200,000 dying. Now, that's what this doctor just said, that although we have a wonderful medical system here, they don't have the resources to handle that kind of massive pandemic, and that's the issue. We could easily be overwhelmed with that, just as people in West Africa have been overwhelmed with that, their infrastructure, everything in that country. The doctor at Emory University talked to Scientific American, and he told them they had 21 nurses, 5 doctors, and hundreds of staff persons working with those 2 people that they brought back, the first 2, Dr. Kent Brandley and the assistant. And now, how many times can they do that? They did that, and they had that many people because they had to sterilize everything. They got in industrial autoclaves to burn and sterilize everything they came in contact with. So they had a massive amount of staff for just those 2 people. What happens to our medical capacity when that number expands exponentially? Already today, we saw just yesterday they were saying they're isolating 12 to 18 people. Then we see this morning it was 80. Now Reuters is reporting 100 people have come in contact. Now, they're not isolating these people yet. They've only isolated 4 people. So they're still allowing these other people. I don't know what they're doing to monitor them. I mean, considering the press conference yesterday, I think that did a lot to scare a lot of people. The fact that they would make that kind of mistake and the fact that they would not even address it up front is what I find absolutely amazing.
Right, they were trying to cover their tracks. I mean, 100 people exposed, those are the people they know about. I mean, how long was it? 4 days he was walking around Dallas. There could be hundreds more that were exposed that they don't know about, and there's no way to track them down.
Well, they're only concerned about 2 things, continuity of government and continuity of their career. Okay, so they're not going to admit that anything is wrong. When I started in engineering, I was working with quality control. If we had something that went wrong, the first thing we had to do to a customer was to explain to them what the procedures were that we screwed up and how those were going to be changed so that wouldn't happen again. We didn't hear that from Rick Perry. We didn't hear that from the Texas officials or the CDC. We just heard, don't worry, we're experts. We've been working on this for years. We know what we're doing, and we've got a great system here in America.
I mean,
America, go.
I mean, I watched that yesterday, and it didn't seem very convincing. They seemed to be in quite of a fluster trying to answer those questions that were being thrown at them. But another point is, you know, you mentioned when Bradley was brought in with the other doctors, the sophisticated procedures that were necessary to ensure his proper isolation. We don't know if that's the case in the Texas hospital. Also, planes. You cannot sterilize planes. You know, they're massive flying computers. There were experts on CNN today saying that it's just not possible to sterilize planes. So Ebola victims could have been on planes. They could be reused for subsequent journeys, and other people could become infected. So all kinds of possibilities here. Then we have a seeming cover-up to some extent, or just trying to dampen hysteria on this potential for the airborne transmission of Ebola. Again, a story out of Infowars.com yesterday. Canadian Health Agency deletes info on airborne spread of Ebola. And they had it in their original mode of transmission directives on their official website, the Public Health Agency of Canada. Quote, airborne spread of Ebola among humans is strongly suspected. Later, that was amended to read airborne transmission has not been demonstrated between non-human primates. And again, the UN chief, the head of the Ebola team for the United Nations, came out today and said that there's a nightmare prospect that the virus could mutate and become airborne if it's not quickly brought under control. So, of course, current understanding is that it's not airborne, but his point is if we allow it to circulate, if we don't nip it in the bud now, then it could mutate as it spreads amongst the population, and that could cause it to go airborne. Again, that's not Infowars saying that. It's not Alex Jones saying that. It's the head of the UN Ebola team saying that, David Knight.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And I got to say, when I read the account last night of the patient who came here and what he was doing before he came here, it was pretty clear that it's not being communicated to the people of Liberia what they need to do to protect themselves from the spread of the disease. And the problem is it's not being communicated to people of America either.
We'll be back on the Alex Jones Show with David Knight taking some of your calls. Stay tuned. Breaking news, Infowars.com. We'll be right back. Don't go away. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to talk to Lionel, who has been a regular guest and contributor to Infowars.com. He's going to talk about some of the cultural issues that surround these subjects. Going to talk about ISIS, Syria, and a number of different other topics. Now we're talking about Hong Kong, because of course we had these huge protests erupt over the past few days. I put out an article on Infowars.com. Hong Kong politician fears mini Tiananmen in response to unrest. And this was a politician who was actually against the protesters. She blamed the political party that she was in opposition to for stirring up these protesters. So this invocation of a potential new Tiananmen Square in terms of a Beijing military crackdown on these demonstrators could be seen as more of a threat than anything. But she basically said that they should respect authority. They shouldn't be carrying out these protests against the Chinese government, because this started back in August, I believe it was, where China put out this advisory where they said that they now see Hong Kong as basically their own fiefdom after the special administrative region was handed to them by the British back in 1997, under the understanding that Hong Kong would retain its political freedoms, its electoral freedoms, until at least 2047. So now China comes in and says, we have the right to choose your political candidates before you can vote on them. Understandably, that has caused a massive revolt in Hong Kong. Now we've got huge protests, tear gas, some police brutality attempting to disperse those demonstrators. And David Knight, more on this in terms of the identity of the protest movement involved in this.
Yeah, Paul, so much for the promises of communists, okay? They said they were going to give them 50 years, and already they're cracking down here. But it's starting to reach ahead again. They have Hong Kong protesters. They tried to get them to stand down. Even some of the leaders were telling them to stand down, and yet the people stepped up their demonstrations. They occupied offices. Now we have reports out of The Guardian today that police have been seen carrying rubber bullets and other kit into compound housing offices of the chief executive that they are occupying. They said pictures that are widely shared on social media are showing police carrying long boxes, a barrel that is labeled round 38mm rubber baton, multi, another with a 1.5-inch CS on it, possibly a reference to CS gas. So it looks like they're going to start getting rough. You know, you carried that article on Monday about the official talking about they didn't want to see Tiananmen Square coming. And I had just seen a picture before I saw your article of a small woman, very small woman in a red dress, barefoot, right in the face of half a dozen guys just armed to the teeth and in full riot gear that were towering over her about a foot taller than she was. I looked at that and I said, that is the Hong Kong version of Tiananmen Square. That is the resolution of these people. But there's something else behind this. There's the Wall Street Journal article that came out today that essentially looked at the Christian influence of this. It said the Hong Kong democracy protests carry a Christian mission for some. Now, Christians understand where this is going. This is not simply a political issue. It impinges on every freedom. And, of course, we all know how severely the Chinese government has persecuted Christians. When I was in mainland China and we took a train from mainland China to Hong Kong, we could tell that we were out of mainland China and approaching Hong Kong because we started seeing crosses. You don't see that in mainland China. So they know where this is headed, and just like the Black Regiment that was part of the American Revolution here, and that was the clergy who got up in front of the independence movement, in front of the religious movement. It's one of the reasons why free speech and freedom of religion is our very first amendment, recognizing our God-given freedoms. They understood that. That's why the American clergy was up front. The same thing is essentially happening in Hong Kong. Unfortunately, here in America, most of the people in the churches will take the position of that lady saying, obey your government. Just sit down and shut up, obey your government. They don't see where this is headed, even into Christian persecution. And so what they're saying is that Hong Kong churches are playing a very quiet but important role in the city's protests, offering food and shelter to demonstrators, with some organizers and supporters citing Christian values as the inspiration for their fight. And they have a political scientist here saying that Christians and the Chinese government, the difference is unbridgeable. They say Christians, by definition, don't trust the communists. The communists have suppressed Christians wherever they are. And, of course, we know that is true. They even talked to a couple of the Occupy leaders. One is a Baptist minister. Another one said he's a Christian, but he wouldn't talk about his faith in detail. He said his faith was in the streets. He knew that they were going to stand up to this. So there's one other data point that we see, just like that app that guy was talking about, how they could communicate with each other over short distances without Wi-Fi, without cell phone.
We'll be back with more on the situation in Hong Kong and your calls coming up. This is the Alex Jones Show Live, Infowars.com. Don't go away. Quick breaking news on the individual who came into Dallas with Ebola. Liberia to prosecute man who brought Ebola to U.S., reports the Associated Press. Liberian authorities say they plan to prosecute the man infected with Ebola who brought the disease to the United States, saying he'd lied on his airport health questionnaire. So more questions about whether he traveled to the U.S. simply to get better treatment than he might expect to get in Africa. Before the break, we were touching upon the Hong Kong protests. US now admits it's funding Occupy Central, reports Anthony Cartolucci out of Land Destroyer. Basically, he refers to a Washington Post article which states, quote, Chinese leaders unnerved by protests elsewhere this year have been steadily tightening controls over civic organizations on the mainland, suspected of carrying out the work of foreign powers. Later in the article, they go on to explain how the Chinese president and Vladimir Putin are talking about this Hong Kong situation as if it could be a staged, or at least hijacked, colour revolution. So now they're saying that these Hong Kong protests could have been funded by the likes of the National Endowment for Democracy, which we've seen before with the Arab Spring, and of course in Kiev with the overthrow of the democratically elected government there, were very much evident in hijacking and steering the protests. Again, not to say that this Hong Kong situation isn't founded on genuine grievances. It obviously is, given that Beijing has basically announced that now it's going to hand-select political candidates in Hong Kong before people can vote on them, again eviscerating their freedoms that they've cherished for a long time, and defended staunchly against potential Chinese imposition. David Knight, your take on these claims that the US, the CIA, the NDE could be hijacking the Hong Kong protests as a form of destabilization aimed at China?
Well, no doubt they are. They always use these. They always use these Machiavellian calculations, and they will always fund the enemy of their enemy, whether they want to do it. And they will always try to co-opt any movement. That is always an issue anywhere. But just because they give money to them as they've given to other people, that doesn't delegitimize the movement. I believe there's a lot more to this. I believe there's a lot more to some of these other movements that have been funded. So just as we see that there are people in Islamic countries that are angry and furious and activated because of the American presence there. They use those people, they manipulate that, they build it up to create another threat. We understand that there is a large part of the American government that is in the military-industrial complex that is always fomenting unrest, always fomenting war, because that is in their interest. And we understand that there's competing blocks, but there are still very legitimate things that are going on here in Hong Kong. And I think the people there, as I mentioned before, they truly understand the issue of freedom. And when the Chinese government steps in and says, we are not going to allow you to have any candidate stand for election unless they have pledged their loyalty and love for mainland Chinese communists, that was the impetus of this. That's where it began. And it's up to those people in Hong Kong, just as it is to anyone everywhere, to make sure that their freedom movements don't get co-opted by other people, just as we've seen that happening here with the Tea Party, with Occupy America. That doesn't Occupy Wall Street. We don't delegitimize the grievances of those people, but they have to be aware that their movements and their grievances aren't taken over by people who are just going to co-opt that and shove it aside and push that down and not address what they want to have happen.
And I mean, the situation in China, they have alternate political parties in China, but they're it's in name only. I mean, the alternate political party leaders have to go to, again, pledge their love for the Communist Party of China on basically a monthly basis. They have to go to a kind of brainwashing session where they get the talking points from the Communist Party, even though they're supposedly representing an alternative, and they have to profess their allegiance to the Communist Party. So this is what Beijing is trying to impose on Hong Kong, which up until now has been its own autonomous state, of course, since being handed back to China by the British in '97. But those freedoms, those protections were supposed to be legally bound, protected against communist incursion. Now Beijing is trying to roll that back, which is why you see a lot of the protests. Moving on, though, there's a story out of California, David. I mean, we've talked about this before. In fact, there was a case, I remember, a couple of years ago, one of the stars of the National Geographic Doomsday Preppers show. He basically went in to get treated for back pain at his local doctor's. They took him to be suicidal. He later ended up having his gun seized because he may have self-harmed or whatever the excuse was. Now we're seeing that a similar case in California, David, where they're talking about family members of gun owners ratting them out and potentially leading to gun confiscation. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, that's a bill that was signed into law by Governor Jerry Brown. It's the first law in the United States that's going to give families who think that a close relative might commit gun violence, it gives the family the ability to petition for a restraining order, essentially have that person's firearms taken away. Now, of course, we don't want to see mentally ill people with firearms, but it all boils down to what is the process here. Is this due process is going on? Is there another agenda? And I would say, Paul, that since virtually all these cases are predicated not by gun ownership, but by the use of SSRIs, why can't the family petition that they get their SSRIs taken away? I mean, they're not going to do anything to address what we all believe here at InfoWars is the root cause of this, and that is the increased conditions. When you take these SSRIs for psychological conditions, in many cases it exacerbates those conditions, especially if someone comes off of the SSRIs. So that's really what they need to address, and the fact that they are not looking at that makes you understand that there's a different agenda here. This is strictly another way to control firearms and to do it without due process.
Okay, we're going to go to some of your calls now. John in Michigan's been holding a while. We'll go to John. You're on the air.
I want to talk about this lady from Gainesville, Georgia. Her name is Ashley Huff. She was only 23. She was arrested for possessing a spoon covered in SpaghettiO residue, tomato sauce. And she spent about 47 days in jail after she couldn't make all these appointments for drug testing and for and all this I don't know, these weird appointments they gave her. And her public defender even came out and said, it's a giant mistake, you know, and it ruined her life. And it's sad because they tried to get her to take the plea bargain the whole time, just plead guilty, you know, and we'll let you out, you know. And it's pretty sad. But also, I was looking at, there's been like formerly classified documents that have been obtained from the Department of Defense that reveal that like colloidal silver has an effect against fighting Ebola, you know, with your immune system. It helps fight the hemorrhagic fever. And apparently they've been trying to block shipments going to Africa. The World Health Organization has recently blocked several shipments.
Yeah, I've read about that story. I don't know if it's confirmed or not, but it definitely seems to be one that keeps cropping up. Referring to the previous story, I mean, David, isn't this, you know, emblematic of a banana republic where you commit some petty crime that's mistaken, you get trapped in the penal system, and you can't get out? I mean, that really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it?
It really does. And, you know, the SpaghettiOs is an extreme case of that. But look at the reality that 80% of the people in prison for drug offenses are there for possession of marijuana. We have more people in prison than any other country per population, way more than communist China that we were just talking about. And most of them are there because of marijuana. So, you know, when we look at this prison system, there's a lot of profit that is there for the private prison companies in a lot of different areas, but it's a way for the government to exercise control. There's a lot of ballot initiatives coming up where people would have, in Alaska and other places, there's marijuana that is on the ballot. Are they going to allow medical marijuana? Are they going to decriminalize it? I think it's something that people need to take a very close look at, and we need to question whether or not we want to continue this drug war that's gone on now for 40, 50 years. It started back in the 70s when Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, and then it went into steroids with Ronald Reagan, where they had mandatory minimums and all other kinds of things that filled up the prisons. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. Our experiment with alcohol prohibition didn't work. The only difference is that with alcohol prohibition, they did it legally. They passed a constitutional amendment. They don't even have the constitutionally legal authority to prohibit marijuana or any of these other drugs that they're now enforcing as part of the war on drugs. That's something people need to take a look at.
5% of the world's population in the United States, yet it has 25% of the world's prison population. That makes the United States the world's largest jailer. I mean, these stats are ridiculous. Since 1970, the prison population in the United States has increased 700%.
And most of that is the war on drugs. And I've had law enforcement against prohibition on many times. I've interviewed them on the nightly news. Jim Gierach, a former prosecutor in Cook County in Chicago. And he started out believing that they could stop this by interdiction, that they could stop it by force, just as many people believe that they could stop the harmful effects of alcohol that way. You can't. It's a social problem. It's a psychological problem. It's a spiritual, it's a medical problem. It is not a law enforcement problem. And so they need to address it that way. That's what's filling up our prisons, and there's a lot of very sinister undercurrents to that with the private prisons and other things like that. But it's that legal system. That's where we first began losing our rights to due process, where they could essentially charge inanimate objects with crimes and just confiscate them. So even before the war on terror, we had the war on drugs as essentially attacking the fundamental basis of our liberty and our right to the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. I mean, talking about due process with these guns, I mean, we have lost due process so many decades ago with the war on drugs.
Pamela in California, you're on the air. Go ahead, Pamela.
Hi, I'm calling because I wanted to let everyone know about there's a Texas federal lawsuit to force Obama and DHS to stop illegal alien dump of illegal aliens that are not pre-screened for illnesses, criminal background, and identity, and quarantine these people as well as people traveling legally from Ebola-stricken areas. And there's actually a hearing on this lawsuit October 29th in Brownsville, Texas, at the federal courthouse at 10 in the morning. And Orly Tates is a private citizen. She's a doctor of dentistry in California. And she's a private citizen. She brought this lawsuit, and she's doing the work that all the state attorney generals and all the state governors should be doing in trying to defend herself and defend other citizens of this country from the federal government's lack of protecting us by sealing the borders, by ensuring people coming over the border aren't carrying seriously contagious, deadly illnesses like Ebola. So I was calling about that, and it just really demonstrates, actually Governor Perry was alerted of this lawsuit, hasn't done anything to become an intervener or to join the lawsuit, and then also the State Attorney General of Texas was alerted by myself. I called both offices. So we're in a sorry state of affairs where even our states are not protecting us from the federal government.
Yeah, I mean, we've got an article on Infowars.com which kind of ties into that, which is Rand Paul blaming political correctness for hindering scientific decisions on Ebola outbreak. And we've seen this at the border, haven't we, David, where even the ISIS threat now is being ignored, even though we had the leaks from within law enforcement sources that ISIS was active in Mexico just across the border, being ignored by the Obama administration because its border agenda is diametrically opposite to having anything safe and secure. What's your take on that, David?
Well, yeah, you mentioned Rand Paul's interview saying that it was political correctness. There was an article up that Dredge linked to on Breitbart. Nancy Pelosi chides a reporter for using the term illegal alien. You know, when they asked her a question about illegal aliens, she said, are you referring to undocumented people who are in the United States? And he says, illegal alien, yes, ma'am. She said, undocumented people. Okay. So we've got 13,500 people, the Daily Caller says, in these two countries that are under an Ebola pandemic that have visas to enter the United States. Now, if you got a visa permission, there are certain conditions in that visa. They are granting you permission to enter. Why can't we at least have the conditions that people are going to be quarantined? We've got dogs coming into the UK, as we mentioned yesterday, 21 days if they're coming in from the EU or the United States. If they're coming in from other countries, 3 months. Why can't we at least protect our human population as much as other countries are concerned about protecting their dogs? It's just political correctness.
Josh in Kansas, you're on the air. Go ahead, Josh.
Hey, guys. Great listening to you. I wanted to talk to you a couple things real quick. One about the Ebola. I know you're not MDs or anything, but you know, kind of what's the best thing to protect ourselves against it? I got a 7-year-old daughter that, you know, concerns me. The other thing, just what you guys brought up a minute ago with that other caller about the war on drugs, it's just a joke. It is absolutely a joke. You find me anywhere that pothead is going to do half the damage that somebody out drinking is going to do. It's just not going to happen. So the war on drugs, that's absolutely just a joke.
Well, I mean, with Ebola, There really is nothing you can. I guess you could avoid large population areas. Obviously, you have to avoid West Africa. But apart from that, David, there's really not a lot. There's no known cure that's been actually established at the moment. They're working on vaccines, drugs. Some have been successful, some haven't. Apart from that, it's... And again, I make the point... Go ahead.
You can take a look at what the CDC recommends. Might start with what they're recommending for airplanes. There's several publications where they're putting out their advice for that. But, there's certain risks that we just take every day. Every day we run down the road, we're pretty close to people that are passing us, just a few feet away from somebody that's coming at me 60 miles an hour, and I'm going 60 miles an hour. So there's an element of risk that we all accept in our everyday life. One of the things you can do is make sure that your immune system is in as good a shape as possible. I do believe that there's also something that silver is very effective. I take that on a regular basis. So does my family. I think that's very effective at not only controlling bacteria, but other studies have said that they thought that it was effective at controlling viruses. So you can do some research in that. I would just say, make sure, as you should, whether it's going to be from a pandemic or whether it's some kind of a power outage, you should prepare in advance a little bit, have some extra food in case something does turn up in your community and they start quarantining and isolating things. It could be difficult for you to get access to food and water. So just make sure you have that there like you would if you were preparing for a storm. You need to always have a certain amount of preparation, and then just try to prepare yourself to be as healthy as possible. Many of these people who are survivalists will say that people who have medical issues aren't going to make it past the first couple of days if there's some kind of a grid down scenario because they just aren't in physical shape. So try to get yourself and your family in as good a possible physical shape as you can.
We're coming back on the Alex Jones Show Live. We're going to talk to Lionel in the next segment. More of your calls coming up with David Knight on all these domestic and global issues. InfoWarsStore.com. That's the website for all the health products. Stay tuned. We're still covering Ebola. David Knight's got some interesting info on the American doctor who came back into Atlanta to receive treatment. We've heard about the ZMapp being pretty hit and miss, but David, some interesting info on how he was treated for Ebola.
Yeah, when we first heard about it, we heard a lot about the fact that he recovered based on the ZMapp vaccine. Of course, that's a vaccine that's been developed by the U.S. military and tobacco companies. Very interesting genetically modified plantibody. It's not a traditional vaccine. But in a question interview with Scientific American, the medical director at Emory University, where Kent Brantley and the lady who was working with him were treated, they said it's been reported that Brantley received a blood transfusion from a recovered patient. And they asked him about that. Of course, the medical director said, I cannot comment on what I read on his chart. So that brings into even more question the efficacy of ZMapp, because we've had 2 people who supposedly were treated with it and recovered, 2 people who were treated with it and died, 3 people who were treated with it, and we still don't know the outcome of theirs. But that's not really anything that's any better than we've seen from the people who were not treated. So further down in the interview, they asked him about the ethics of giving vaccines to patients that have not, where the vaccines have not been fully vetted for safety and for efficacy. Of course, we know that the CDC not only is lying about checking people at the borders, but they also lied about the autism connection to vaccines in a study that was put out 10 years ago and covered that up for 10 years. But he makes an interesting comment. He says, well, I think it's ethical to study experimental biologicals and vaccines, but we have to be extremely cautious. It's not as though we have something we know works. So he apparently doesn't have any confidence in the ZMapp vaccine.
And another thing you said was they told him he could be contagious for up to 7 months. That was interesting.
Yes, they said that they have noticed that people are shedding the Ebola virus, people who have recovered. They asked him about the immunity of the doctor, and they said, yes, he does have immunity now to that strain of Ebola, but there's 5 strains of Ebola. And they said that people continue to shed the virus in their sexual fluids and their urine for several months after, up to 7 months afterwards. So that is another vector of transmission that is possible, although they said that they had not, they see that being shed, but they have not verified that somebody has caught it by that method.
In an article you mentioned earlier out of the Weekly Standard, White House screening procedures in place at our border. White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest told reporters today that after the Ebola case in Dallas, the Obama administration reminded border law enforcement agencies of the protocol to deal with people. So they're saying they reminded them as if these measures were already in place, but we know they weren't, David.
Yeah, we see the same thing in this interview with the medical director at Emory University in the Scientific American interview that we heard from Perry and from the CDC yesterday. He says, as we've been saying all along, we feel the high fatality rates in developing parts of the world where this infection occurs are because of a lack of resources. Yet, when you look at how rapidly this has expanded, in a country where they only have 4 million people, in just 6 months they've had 3,000 cases, 2,000 of those people have died. And when you normalize that to the population of the United States, as we said before, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of people coming down with it, hundreds of thousands of people dying. Do we really have a medical system that can handle that kind of burden on it? I would say no. So people need to be cautious about this. At this point, there's very little that we can do, but need to try to educate yourself about how this is transmitted.
David Knight, thanks for joining us. We'll be up with Lionel Media in studio next, talking to Lionel about a number of different topics. Alex Jones Show Live, stay tuned. Thursday, October 2nd, 2014. It's Paul Joseph Watson filling in for Alex Jones today. Coming up in the next segment, we're going to be joined by Lionel, who of course has been on the show before, to talk about a number of interesting topics. Also going to take your calls for Lionel later in the hour, but for now we're going to squeeze in a quick call. American in North Carolina, you're on the air, go ahead.
I'd like to talk about Ebola and how it's the main topic in all the mainstream articles, along with Jesse Matthew and the Secret Service, and at the bottom of all that, in the small fine print, is enterovirus, and that's probably what people really ought to be concerned with. Is Ebola's really not going to hit America that hard because we're not third world, but enterovirus already killed the first victim in Rhode Island, and I think the man might be trying to divert us on the Secret Service front. Those people, the Secret Service, man, they did the righteous call in not killing, a citizen, an American. Whereas, the state police like South Carolina, they got no problem with it. So I'd like to commend them for that.
Yeah, I mean, this enterovirus thing's really concerning. We've got an article out of CNN, enterovirus D68 found in 4 patients who have died, including 10-year-old girl. Samples collected from 4 patients who recently died have tested positive for the enterovirus D68, according to the CDC. So this is actually killing people. Ebola is not killing anyone yet. This is of greater immediate concern, but again, obviously, Ebola could have the greater, wider concern. But this, as you said, is something that is getting buried under the radar. Thanks for the call. Jeremiah in California. Go ahead, Jeremiah.
Yes, I have a couple quick comments, please. I was wanting to get your take on this. I was listening to Joseph Israel, and he was saying that everyone who does not support the New World Order will not be able to buy or sell, so they're just going to get out of the New World Order, and everyone who stays in the New World Order is going to go down with the system. And also, the cure for Ebola would be anything that cures a virus, like vitamin C, lemon, grapefruit, or turmeric, or tangerine, cinnamon, ginger. It's a virus, so anything that cures a virus could cure the Ebola. And also, I think Alex should stay in the radio studio and give the reporters the TV studio. He has a great vibe and environment in his radio studio.
I think Alex enjoys being in the radio studio, but I mean the new studio that they've just built is really professional, so that's why he also enjoys doing his special reports in there. We've got Hap in Minnesota. Hap, go ahead.
Yeah, hey, welcome to the U.S., Paul Joseph, and nice to hear it from you always, Michael. Hey, I was, I've been thinking about this for some time now. 2 months ago, you just talked about it, Michael, about the 2 people that came back and they said they're cured. It just freaked me out how they said that they're cured, but yet they don't talk about them very much. And you were just talking about this subject a few minutes ago, Michael, so I was just touching base with that. The other thing is, it's a great cover-up, isn't it? Nobody's talking about the VA or the IRS or Fast and Furious at the moment. So it's all, it's like the page has been turned once again. Once again, I say, because, their cover-ups or their scandals are just stacking chapter after chapter on top of each other. And just one more quick note. My brother from South America, he fled a long time ago. He mentioned I should start making Ebola concert T-shirts with all the dates of the cities that Ebola is going to come and hit in the U.S. Thanks for
the Ebola
everything,
Grand
guys.
Tour. Thanks for the call. We'll be back after the break with Lionel. We're going to be taking your calls as well on the line for Lionel, lionelmedia.com. Stay tuned. It's the Alex Jones Show live with me, Paul Joseph Watson, Infowars.com. Don't go away. Filling in for Alex Jones, we're going to be taking your calls in the next half an hour for Lionel at 1-800-259-9231. But Lionel is a nationally syndicated radio host and television personality, as well as media commentator. You can check him out at lionelmedia.com. Also does a series of great YouTube videos, which we occasionally feature on Infowars.com. And, of course, he's been a regular guest over the past couple of months. Lionel, welcome to the show.
But never Paul Joseph Watson, or as the last caller called you, Michael.
Michael.
Is this some kind of a code, some type of a black ops? Michael?
There must be some conspiracy behind it.
Yes. But let me just first, kudos to you, my friend. Excellent, excellent, excellent job. Touche. Bravo.
You're too kind, Lionel.
I'm not being too kind. This is tough stuff. If you were doing conventional talk radio, you could be talking about the Judices from Real Housewives of New Jersey being sentenced, or Derek Jeter's farewell, or maybe some other non-irrelevant. But you're talking about pandemics, death, the new Black Plague. That's rather taxing. Good for you. Excellent, excellent job, sir.
I guess we should be talking about Chelsea Clinton's baby or something like that. That's the
incredible timing, don't you think? How did they do that? But I'll tell you something. I want to, and also, please, Michael, let me, that's your nickname from now on. That's our code.
Alex gives me enough nicknames. I've got enough as it is.
I can imagine. We'll call you Misha to make it sound more,
more European.
Porky Parkish. But anyway, your treatises, your disquisitions, your journalistic pieces have been superb. And I've told people so much as that read what he is saying. Read his, meaning you, read your work. And when you first read the actual subject matter, you think, oh, come on, this guy's gone off the reservation now. I mean, finally, Paul Joseph Watson, a.k.a. Misha, has finally lost it. And then you read it, and again, it is cited, documented, linked, not merely you opining, not what you think the world is, but you, and this goes for Alex and David and the entire team, you never merely say, you know, I think that never. It's always, no, here is the story, here is what I've heard. So again, I'm always defending you, Paul Joseph Watson. I'm always defending you with, oh, that Alex Jones. He's what? He's what? Well, he's what? Is he ecclesiastical? He acts like a reverend? Is that it? Now, if you're on a religious show and you say the same thing and you start speaking in tongues on a Sunday morning, and I in no way am in any way trying to impugn people of faith, but you could say the same thing, and yet that is okay. But when you're vitriolic, you're hyperbolic, you're excited, you're perhaps exaggerated by some standards, then people say, this guy's off the reservation. And the reason why is because we're used to the news being so bloody boring. Absolutely just soporific. Just, you know, radio or TV version of Ambien. But I got to tell you something. You brought up something last week which again, I find myself 3 times a day at least saying, what kind of a parallel I was just telling Nico on the break. What kind of a parallel universe am I in? What is that? Why doesn't anybody run out in the street and say, ah, David Cameron before the UN. You're David Cameron. You're David Cameron. Not mine, yours.
Don't lump him on me, Lionel.
He stood up and he said, he basically dusted off the cognitive infiltration theme, which we'll get to. And in front of the UN, dusted off this, I thought, hoary, antediluvian, ancient idea about going after conspiracy theories. You would think somebody in the group would say, listen, DC, come here, lose that talk. You're really, this is the United States, I know this is the UN, but don't talk about telling people if they opine about 7/7 or 9/11 that somehow they're practicing nonviolent extremism.
Tell you what, let's play the clip, Lionel. Let's play the clip now and we can talk about it. Here's David Cameron in front of the UN. Roll the clip.
We must defeat this ideology in all its forms. As evidence emerges about the backgrounds of those convicted of terrorist offences, it is clear that many of them were initially influenced by preachers who claim not to encourage violence, but whose worldview can be used as a justification for it. We know this worldview, the peddling of lies, that 9/11 was somehow a Jewish plot, or that the 7/7 London attacks were staged. The idea that Muslims are persecuted all over the world as a deliberate act of Western policy. The accusations. We must be clear. To defeat the ideology of extremism, we need to deal with all forms of extremism, not just violent extremism. For governments, there are some obvious ways we can do this.
Okay, that's enough.
We must ban preachers of...
Lionel, 3 days after that, I believe, the Home Secretary, Theresa May, came out in the UK and added to that, said that basically anyone who wants to use Twitter or Facebook, who is a domestic extremist, in their words, a non-violent extremist, would have to get government permission to do so. I mean, this is creepy, it's Orwellian, but as you said, the very fact that he's talking about it would raise suspicions. I mean, that would make people believe that 7/7 and 9/11 were in some way staged if they're having to go to these lengths to censor people.
That's precisely right. If he were to say, now I know many of you today believe that I am a reptilian sorcerer. What? No, we didn't think that. Why would it? And I know to you who think that I'm daft. No, maybe we should. Look, I thought, and I'm sorry, but for that terrible accent, I in no one, in any way, want to appear Anglophobic or whatever the particular phrase is, but he's speaking before the UN, whatever that's worth, and this is what he comes up with. Let's hearken back to the granddaddy of all, one of the most frightening pieces of either juridical or legal or academic balderdash, bunkum, and hooey was a piece co-written by Cass R. Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule, I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, both from Harvard Law School, entitled Conspiracy Theories. This is the Magna Carta. This was in 2008. And if I could, and I don't like reading things, but there's no way I could, Michael, do this justice without reading just this. This is from the précis or the abstract. Many millions of people hold conspiracy theories. They believe that powerful people have worked together in order to withhold the truth about some important practice or some terrible event. Stop right there. That's history. Go through history. Governments, people, organizations, holding back the truth. This is the subject matter of an academic treatise on where did these people come up with this plumb crazy idea that governments. What has your whole show been today? It's about Ebola and the lies, the prevarication, the harm that is being hidden. but let me just, this is what he said. I must. Those who subscribe to conspiracy theories may create serious risks, including risks of violence. And the existence of such theories raises questions, raises significant challenges for policy and law. The first challenge is to understand the mechanisms by which conspiracy theories prosper. The second challenge is to understand how such theories might be undermined. Now, he's talking about, not only do we want to understand, okay, fine. We can talk about why are people superstitious? Why are people not, whatever. Fine, I understand that. But how can we undermine them? Here is the important, and I'll just leave it at this. Because those who hold conspiracy theories typically suffer from a crippled epistemology. A crippled epistemology, in accordance with which it is rational to hold such theories, the best response. Let me stop right there. This is Obama's regulation czar. This is the husband of Samantha Power. This is a noted legal heavyweight, rock star, juridical and academic bigwig. He says, the best response consists in cognitive infiltration of extremist groups. Paul Joseph Watson, every single thing that you talk about, that I talk about, that anybody talks about, could, by any stretch of the imagination, be construed as extreme. Extreme by what standard? I am a lawyer by trade, and a statute is per se unconstitutional when it is susceptible to reasons, to explanations, to interpretations that are inconsistent, that you read and you're not sure. For example, the statute that says, do no wrong. I don't know what that means. Paul Joseph Watson, what is extreme? Can truth be extreme?
That's the question we'll ask after the break, Lionel. Stay there. It's the Alex Jones Show Live, Infowars.com. We'll be back with your calls. Don't go away. Live on the Alex Jones Show with Lionel of LionelMedia.com. Going to be taking a few of your calls for Lionel at 1-800-259-9231. That's 1-800-259-9231. So get those lined up. For the next segment, we just played a clip of David Cameron in front of the United Nations last week. Basically, he was talking about ISIS. He made a comparison, basically saying that anybody who is a non-violent extremist is in the same category as ISIS. What did he characterize as a non-violent extremist? Basically, anyone who questions the government narrative on events such as the 7/7 attacks in London or 9/11. So it's basically this process, and we asked the question before the break, what is considered extreme? This process of creating a new brand of thought crime to, in fact, brand individuals who espouse it. Any questioning of the government narrative whatsoever is not only a conspiracy theory anymore, which they've used as that pejorative term to demonize free thought, to demonize the questioning of any motive of any person in a position of power. Now they've gone one step further, Lionel, and are saying that you could be in league with the terrorists. I mean, we saw after 9/11, we must never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, George W. Bush. Now they're saying that we could be in league with the terrorists by espousing this dangerous notion of questioning government. How extreme is that?
Well, let me ask you this, Paul Joseph Watson. Let's say I were to question the government, and I hate air quotes, but I will do it. I question the government, not out of any kind of nefarious wrongdoing, but let's just say I think they're inept. Let's say that I question the Warren Commission. Now, another question is there a statute of limitations to my questioning the government? If I question the findings of the Maine in 1898, there was certainly complicity. I think we all can understand that. If I were to question the United States' role in, let's say, Operation Ajax, the overthrow of Mossadegh. Oh, by the way, another question is, let's say I were to question something now, and something is declassified. So imagine a Paul Joseph Watson in the era of Mossadegh and the Shah, who says, I think the CIA was involved in that. Under this theory were to be enacted, Paul Joseph Watson, a.k.a. Michael, is incarcerated. Now, years later, the CIA declassifies it and says, you know what, we were right. Do we let you out? Isn't that called academic quest? I mean, do because I can question, and not 9/11, but I can question anything. I can question the government in saying that Agent Orange was far more lethal and teratogenic and problematic and depleted uranium and DU. I'm not saying the government. I could be questioning the finding based on ineptitude, bad sample size. I could have a pretty clinical way. So this broad brush admonition, don't question your elders, covers everything from the most benign disagreement. Let me ask you this. Last week, Senator Bob Graham of the 9/11 Commission said, I want this redacted testimony back. I want it known regarding Saudi Arabia's involvement in 9/11. Is that nonviolent extremism? Is he not calling into question his own commission? Is this internal nonviolent extremist? Is he an internal conspiracy theorist? Is he questioning himself? I mean, think about this. It is our duty. It is our duty. It is inherent. It is in our DNA to question authority, question anything. And you know why? Because we want to. I don't need permission. And by the way, I find this fascinating. As you know, Paul, there are brilliant people out there who, by virtue of having these newfangled devices that we're talking on, can look at something. Remember when they said, look at the video of this horrible ISIS or ISIL or Daesh or Sham? I mean, the names grow. Remember when Gaddafi was ultimately spelled 38 different ways? We like to do that. But the reason why I think they want to ask you, don't go back and look at these videos, because you might see some glaring problem in some bad editing. It's very clever. So don't look at the videos that we've put out. Don't question it. Don't ask. Don't talk. Don't speak. Just nod in hypnotic obeisance.
Your calls for Lionel coming up after the break. LionelMedia.com. We're going to talk about media narratives and the collapse of trust in the mainstream media. This is the Alex Jones Show Live. Infowars.com. Your calls coming up. Stay tuned. It's the Alex Jones Show Live with Lionel. Your calls coming up. First, I just want to mention again, InfoWarsStore.com. We've got Oxy Powder. Again, this is a product that cleans you out while you sleep with gentle oxygen. It's not one of these harsh herbal colon cleansers. There are no nasty side effects. And again, reclaim responsibility, reclaim power over your life by becoming healthy, by boosting your immune system against all the allergies, all the toxins in the environment. This is one of a line of products that we've got here at InfoWarsStore.com. It's the only colon cleansing product with ingredients backed by real clinical studies on safety, and we've just got a new shipment in today. That's Oxy Powder, InfoWarsStore.com. Again, crucial. This is the fuel that drives the InfoWars juggernaut. Helps us out, pay for all the equipment, all the huge bandwidth costs and everything, hire new reporters, expand and dominate the mainstream media, dominate the establishment, which is what we're talking about. With Lionel, we played before the break David Cameron saying in front of the UN, non-violent extremism includes anyone who questions government narratives. And to me, Lionel, I mean, on Twitter, we often see mainstream talking heads lashing out. It's always fun to abuse them on Twitter, like I did with Keith Olbermann. But often they come to me. They lash out against InfoWars without even, being prodded in the first place. You mentioned Cass Sunstein with the cognitive infiltration, subverting the so-called conspiracy movement. This just suggests to me nothing else but how insecure they are about being challenged on any narrative whatsoever. What does it say to you about their insecurity?
Well, first and foremost, you mentioned Twitter, and a shameless plug for mine, and I tweet and retweet and favorite, and if I could do something else to add approbation to your tweets, I would, but I'm at Lionel Media, and I'm a Twitter fanatic. I think it is the pulse and the heartbeat of the world. But here is the thing I don't understand. When, and I don't want to just make too much out of this, but how much can I question? Let me ask again, is there a statute of limitations to that which I question? If I think there were very serious questions as to Vietnam and our involvement and the Gulf of Tonkin, which has been admitted, is that exempted? Next, how can somebody who is theoretically conversant with the First Amendment, a legal scholar at some of the best, ostensibly, legal or law schools in the nation, dare to suggest that the government, ostensibly, should be involved in quashing and quelling and basically stifling speech? As you know, Paul, the First Amendment, in fact, the Bill of Rights, only limits action when the federal government or the state government are involved in violating your law. The federal government, the state government, has to violate your First Amendment right, not individual citizens. The 13th Amendment is the only Bill of Rights, the only constitutional amendment that a private citizen can actually violate, can actually commit. It's the slavery or anti-slavery provision and variations thereof. So here we have, and just think about this, the irony of this, a law professor advocating, not boycotting, which is fine. By God, if those conspiracy theorists out there spew this bunkum, why, you tell them, fine, write your congressman, fine, petition, go ahead, nothing wrong with it. They're talking about cognitive infiltration via the government. This erases any doubt as to a First Amendment involvement in this. How can anyone not say, wait a minute, hold the press to stop, with a president who is ostensibly a constitutional professor? I mean, and this is so blatant, so pathetic, as you say, so desperate, so much of an indicium, of an indication of how this is making headway. And again, there are so many levels. The word conspiracy theorist, I love to harken back to the great Gore Vidal, who said, I am not a conspiracy theorist, I'm a conspiracy analyst. And the word conspiracy theory has been basically a code word for the unspeakable truth. And if you're a truther, how did they appropriate truther as a pejorative? How did this happen? A falser, I can understand. And if you ask any questions from, you pick the subject, this is, we need to revolt non-violently, what am I saying? Non-extremist, but say, wait a minute, no, we are not going to do this. And the best way to protest this non-violently is to fill the airways, fill the Twitter world, the ether, the social media, with your protestations against this idea. Because remember, Paul, what you were talking about, this entire first portion of the show was how the government is not being straight with you and with us regarding Ebola. Is that a conspiracy theory? And if it is, who's conspiring? Who are the conspirators? I don't understand. You might be saying that the government's inept. The government's not doing its job. The government's dropping the ball. We need better CDC officials. We need to fund them. They're inept. That's not conspiratorial, false flag, inside job. You just might be saying, you guys don't know what the hell you're doing. It's that simple.
We're talking with Lionel, LionelMedia.com. Mercedes in Oregon. You're on the air with Lionel. Go ahead, Mercedes.
Hello, Lionel and Paul. Welcome. I wanted to say welcome to, the States, but now you're there with Ebola, so I don't know.
I don't personally have Ebola yet, but thank you.
Maybe you should be going home before there's a quarantine or something.
Maybe we'll all get locked in.
Yeah.
There are worse places to be locked in, though, I'll say that. So what's your question or comment for Lionel?
Yeah, you're definitely with good people. So, yeah, extremism, we have to exactly say no. we not only is it InfoWars, but we have to do a counter narrative. We're the counter narrative to what they're doing. They go in front of the UN and say these horrible things, you know, and we're just, you know, I'm on Twitter too. I don't think I should be, you know, attacked in any way by the government just for saying, hey, you guys aren't doing what you're supposed to be doing.
That's exactly the point. I mean,
that's precisely right.
Go ahead, Lionel.
No, that's precisely right. And Mercedes, or where I'm from, we say Mercedes. I firmly believe that not only does and I say the government, I don't even know what that means. It's not the government. There are people who work for the government. They're fine. They're great patriots and wonderful. But we use that term to speak of a few. But I don't think people realize how big this is. I'm telling you right now, when you listen to me, I know people in the conventional media, in the usual nuts and bolts, meat and potato, terrestrial, old-fashioned radio TV, and they're living in the 50s. Not the 1950s, the 50s. They don't know anything. They're the people who say, you know, I don't understand this Twitter. I guarantee you right now, what we're saying right now lives on in a cloud, in an area that is so huge, so colossal, so, dare I invoke Gulliver, Brobdingnagian, so enormous. Mainstream media don't understand it. These people on TV who fancy themselves as being, you know, the cable news warriors, on their best day, they don't approximate this world out there that represents far more people than anybody can understand. So what happens is, as this, and mark my words, Mercedes and Paul, one day, and I don't know when it is, but very, very soon, tomorrow, next week, somebody of note will all of a sudden say, you know what? I listen to that show, and I believe in that. And somebody will say, wow, of note. You know, when Jenny McCarthy, bless her heart, became viewed as the point person for concerns people had in inoculation and vaccine-related diseases, that was a dark day in any kind of, by the way, vaxxer. Have you heard that, Paul? Vaxxers.
Vaxxers. That's the new pejorative.
Yes, yes. So we need, eventually you're going to hear more people. Rosie O'Donnell, bless her heart, Charlie Sheen, they're kind of been, by virtue of a very scared media, lumped in as the standard bearers, you know, the bellwethers of this new, no. And this is not in any way a slam or a pejorative against them. But when you start hearing people say, no, I agree with this, or I watch this, I understand this, when you start to see the Daily Shows and Colbert and others realize that what they're doing is a cutesy-fied, if that's a word, version of the mainstream media direct, when all of a sudden, like this discussion becomes cool, and people will run to it. And they will say, you mean this has been there? Yes. There are more of us than them. There was a person one time, a dear friend of mine, who gave the expression, he says, you know, there are so many of us that we could drown them, and I know this sounds crude, but he said, we could drown them in our urine. And I thought, oh my God, what a horrible metaphor. But I realized we forget our power, the enormity of this. Because most of us right now are at home, or at work, or we're listening maybe later, a week or so, a year later, and we look around and we're saying, is anybody out there? Oh, yes, absolutely. And all that I have said is, and I think you as well, is I'm not afraid of anything. Paul Joseph Watson, what do you wish you didn't know What truth do you wish you didn't know? What are you sorry for knowing? What information do you wish you were dumb about? Because I haven't figured it out yet. I have not found anything where I say, boy, you know what? I wish I didn't know that historical fact. I wish I didn't know that cancer scare. I wish I didn't know the truth about this war that I thought was noble. Ignorance is not bliss. It's dangerous. And I've never apologized to anybody for wanting to know the truth. I ask questions. You've seen kids. What do kids always ask? Why? Go to room. Why? Go to bed. Why? You need your sleep. Why? They're not being pesky. It's a beautiful question. Why? I don't understand this. I'm not satisfied. Give me an example if I could. Did you happen to see Norah O'Donnell speak recently on CBS with Prince Turki Al Faisal of Saudi Arabia regarding ISIS?
Yeah, we played that clip on the Sunday show, I believe.
Now, wait a minute. Stop. This is where I imagine this scene, like a Kubrick movie. Somebody walks off on the set wearing a headset. He's a stagehand or somebody, and he says, stop, stop, stop. I can't take this anymore. Ask him about how many people they've beheaded. They beheaded a woman recently for sorcery. Did you know that? You're asking a man who lives in who rules basically over a country that beheads women for sorcery. Now let me just let that marinate a little bit. Ask him about his brother, Abdel Rahman Al Faisal, who's the paymaster for ISIS or ISIL or IS or AQI or Al-Nusra Front or Al-Qaeda or Daesh or whatever neologism you want to give it. And Khorasan. You know how many people, did you know this? How many Khorasan members there are, Paul Joseph Watson? 50.
And this was a group that they just invented. I mean, it's basically Al-Nusra, who they were supporting previously, because all the Syrian rebels, the so-called Syrian rebels, defected to Al-Nusra. So they just renamed the group to hide the fact that they had indirectly supported the group before this so-called bombing. It's amazing. Quick call, Judy in Florida. Go ahead, Judy.
Hi, Paul. This is really great to speak with you. I've talked to other hosts on Alex's program. I guess I've called almost as much as McGruff at this point. But I had a story I wanted to tell you very, very quickly, and then I had my question. But I sent out an email when I found out about the first Ebola case, and I sent out to, my network and essentially, discussed what I felt was the gravity of the situation and said this is not fear-mongering, but this is something everybody needs to be aware of, blah, blah, blah. And I brought up the point that the plane had touched down with patient 0 at Dulles International. And the reason why that's significant is because I used to live very close to it. And I got an email back from a very close friend's son, and he said in a very contrite, very condescending way, Ebola is not transferable during incubation. It can only be transmitted with direct contact with feces, saliva, and blood, and that's when most severe symptoms have set in. And I said, well, it's also potentially airborne. I said in a email back to him, and I sent yours and Du's report that had the video of that facility that held the monkeys, the quarantine unit in Reston, Virginia, and to further validate what I was trying to say. And the thing is, the skating rink and the statue in Reston is I used to work right down the street from it, and I used to live in Reston, Virginia. And this guy still lives in Reston, Virginia. But, I think he poo-paws a lot of what I have to say, but I guess what I'm trying to get to is that I'm really kind of tired of being, talked to in a condescending way by anyone, because what I see you and Alex and anybody's got, any want to know the truth, that we're the intellectuals. We're the ones that are the shepherds. We are shepherding those, and we're trying to save the lives of those that are, right now condemning us, that are, not the government that's actually, or the New World Order cabal. Exactly.
That's why we're taking so much flack. That's why, trust in media is now back to its record low. I mean, people are seeing right through that, and they're seeing right through the attacks. So, I mean, that's definitely the case. We're going to be back in the next segment, final segment, with Lionel. We're going to talk about media narratives and how we can shape them. LionelMedia.com is the website, or at Lionel Media on Twitter. This is the Alex Jones Show live, breaking news as it happens at Infowars.com. Stay right there. We'll be back with Lionel after the break. Final segment of the Alex Jones Show with Lionel. There's an update coming from Dallas health officials. They're about to give a press conference here in the next 20 minutes or so about the Ebola situation. Obviously, 100 people exposed at least in Dallas, so hopefully there are no more confirmed cases, but there is about to be another update on that situation in Dallas, so we'll be tracking that, of course, across the website. We're currently talking to Lionel of LionelMedia.com. Lionel, just in the last few minutes, I wanted to get into this recent Gallup poll. Trust in mainstream media returns to its previous all-time low of 40%. And again, it goes back to this David Cameron UN speech. They're petrified of losing their ability to control the narrative. They still have to act in concert to do so, the mainstream media, because they're losing their individual power, their audience. But so long as they can corral everybody around a talking point or around a narrative, they're still able to sway huge numbers of the US population. But obviously, their power in terms of that is diluting. We had Drudge 15 years ago go in front of the National Press Club and basically say that the media landscape is about to completely change. He was dead on accurate. That happened over the next 15 years. Given that they're so insecure now, apparently, about losing the ability to control this narrative, how do you see the media landscape developing over the next 15 years?
Developing?
Degenerating, maybe.
Degenerating, perhaps. Pock-filled. Not only that, conventional talk radio. You name it. Just to give you an idea. First and foremost, I think if I know Alex like I think I know Alex, if you were to be at a press conference and somebody were to turn to you and say yes, and you basically asked the question and said, okay, that's it. Because believe it or not, in certain mainstream media, and I kid you not, I can say that on a family show, they send somebody out to a report. We'll say, kid, all right, Watson, you're new here. We'll give you $25 or a six-pack if you can get the mic flag in the press conference. A little card, little square that fits on the microphone showing the television or radio station's call letters. If you can get that mic flag in, $25 and a six-pack. You think I'm kidding? You don't have to know anything to be in mainstream media. You got to look like Barbie or Ken or be cute, and and that's it. I mean, no, nobody will ever call you in and say, Watson, what the hell do you know about? No, I don't need to know anything. The other day, when Rick Perry was talking, I think with Sean Hannity, Rick Perry said, oh, there's nothing to worry about. Imagine this thought experiment, Paul. What if somebody said, hey, Rick, did you hear the news? Let's just assume we're at a press conference. They just found out that there is a vaccine for Ebola. It's called Gardasil. I mean, he would be all over that. Really? I still have that Merck deal going. This is a guy who basically, talking about vaccines, if I were to meet with a pool of, let's say, Texas media people and said, do you know about Perry, right? And Gardasil? No. HPV? Merck? No. You know anything about that? No. Okay. Wow. If you ask these people, what do you know about? What is your frame of reference? Tell me what you know about Ebola. Listen, Paul, I got to be honest. And I love when people always preface what they're saying with, I got to be honest. Like, well, thanks for letting me know this. But this is about a plague, a pandemic. I have to ask for permission for this? Seriously.
That's right. It's amazing. Lionel, we're wrapping up the show now. LionelMedia.com, at Lionel Media on Twitter. Thanks for joining us. That's going to do it for this edition of The Alex Jones Show. We'll be back tomorrow with more breaking news. Check out InfoWars Nightly News tonight. All the breaking news at Infowars.com. We'll see you tomorrow.